This chapter 2 introduces swaptions of various kinds, teaches you how to distinguish between payers and receivers, and describes an intuitive approach to their pricing. To understand the context for the invention of swaptions, it is useful to think of a borrower managing his medium-term liabilities. Assume the borrower has 5-year floating rate debt at LIBOR plus 75 basis points and is worried that rates may increase. The borrower could, of course, simply swap this debt from floating to fixed. If the 5-year swap rate is 6%, his all-in cost would become 6.75%. The borrower, however, is contemplating currently the divestiture of a division, expected to close in 1 year, which, if implemented, would enable him to prepay the loan and eliminate his related interest rate worries. Still, should the divestiture fail to close, the borrower would like to switch into fixed. So rather than moving ahead immediately with a 5-year swap, the borrower pays an upfront premium of 80 basis points to the bank in return for the privilege of entering a 4-year swap at 6% in 1 year's time, where the borrower pays fixed. One of 4 scenarios is now possible. Scenario 1, the divestiture fails, but rates have stabilized or diminished so that the 4-year swap rate is now below 6%. So when the option expires, it makes no sense for the borrower to exercise it. He is left with floating rate debt at LIBOR plus 75 and can either leave it floating or enter a 4-year swap at the prevailing market rate if he is still eager to fix. Scenario 2, the divestiture fails again and rates have risen, so the borrower exercises the swaption and fixes at 6%. Scenario 3, the divestiture is successful, so the debt is prepaid with the proceeds. If the 4-year swap rate in the market is above 6%, then, ignoring bid-offer spreads, his option would be in the money and he would exercise it. But since he no longer needs the swap, his debt having been prepaid, you will recall, he simply assigns the swap to the bank and collects its fair market value, or positive NPV, which we will define more precisely in a moment. Scenario 4. The divestiture is successful and the debt is prepaid, but rates have dropped and the option is out of the money at expiration, so worth nothing. Of course, the borrower lets the swaption expire, but has no debt still outstanding and so is not particularly upset. A simple term sheet for the swaption appears here. In this situation, we would say that the borrower has purchased a payer swaption in reference to the fact that he is the party acquiring the option and that this option gives him the right to pay the fixed rate of 6%. under the underlying swap rather than receiving it. We always therefore link the descriptive name for the position to the fixed leg of the swap. The bank in this case would be described as having sold a payer. Note, very importantly, the verb purchase, which applied to the borrower, becomes sell from the bank's perspective. But the swap underlying the option is still a payer and does not become a receiver. Now assume an investor owns a floating rate note, FRN, paying LIBOR flat, and is worried that rates may be diminishing, so is considering entering a receive fixed swap to create a synthetic fixed rate investment. The investor, however, is still uncertain about the direction of rates in the near term, so rather than enter into the swap immediately, he pays 80 basis points upfront to the bank in return for the right in 1 year's time to receive fixed at 6% and pay LIBOR for another 4 years. We would say in this case that the investor has bought a receiver swaption and that the bank has sold this receiver swaption. One final word regarding the notation commonly used for swaptions. We refer to the swaption with which we began this chapter as a 1/4. The first figure indicating the tenor in years until the option's expiration, and the second figure indicating the tenor of the underlying swap from the date of expiration of the option, i.e. from when the swap comes alive. Let us now consider the impact on a swaption of movements in the two principal variables that affect its value: shifts in the yield curve and changes in implied vols for interest rates. The effect of vol is simple. Any regular option rises in value when vol rises, so the party long the option has a gain, while the one who is short has a loss. The reverse happens when vol diminishes. The impact of curve shifts is only slightly harder and is more easily understood if we use the bond analogy. When rates fall, the right to receive fixed at a predetermined rate becomes more valuable. So the owner of the receiver swaption has a mark-to-market gain in this scenario, while the seller has a mark-to-market loss. The reverse happens under the payer swaption. And all signs from the second row are reversed in the first row when rates increase. So a trader who thinks that the curve is likely to move down and that vols will also be declining would most logically go short or sell a payer. A trader who feels the curve is likely to rise and that vols are also likely to increase would go long or buy a payer, and so on. We ask you to think, by analogy with other option combinations you have come across, what a trader would do who has no strong directional view on curve shifts, but believes vols are unsustainably high and very likely to decline. Click pause while you think about this. Hopefully you have figured out that the trader would ideally sell a swaption straddle, which means that she would sell both a receiver and a pair, having the same strike, and thus earn two upfront premiums. Assuming rates do not move too much in either direction, she will enjoy a large gain from the diminution in vols, while any loss on either position from a movement in the curve, assuming it is not too large, will be offset to some degree by a gain on the other position, but probably not of the same magnitude. We will illustrate all these effects more precisely in the next chapter when we provide a formal pricing model for swaptions. Just as we did with callable bonds, we now mention important variations on the nature of the option exercise privilege. Swaptions may be European, like the one we described earlier, or Bermudan, or even American. The Bermudan version, of course, may be exercised on more than one single date, but is still limited to specific dates only, while the American version may be exercised on any date prior to expiration. Another crucial issue relevant to the Bermudan and American alternatives is whether the tenor of the underlying swap is fixed up front, in which case we call the instrument a swaption on a constant maturity swap, or if it depends on the date of exercise, diminishing the later the date of exercise, which we then would label a swaption on a remaining maturity swap. The most common version of the latter alternative sets the tenor of the swap, once the option is exercised, to fall on the same termination date as that which would have applied to the swap coming alive if the option had been exercised on its first possible occasion. Stated more simply, if a 5x5 Bermudan is exercised after 3 years, the swap born on that day would have a 7-year tenor, while if exercise happens 1 year later, the swap's tenor would be 6 years. This is best illustrated by comparing the two term sheets appearing now for two possible Bermudan swaptions. Whereas under alternative 1, the tenor of the underlying swap is always 4 years, irrespective of the exercise date. Under alternative 2, the tenor diminishes the later the date of exercise and is always equal to the remaining number of years since inception, assuming a total of 5 years. To repeat, under alternative 1, the underlying swap tenor is always 4 years, irrespective of the exercise date, while under alternative 2, the tenor diminishes the later the exercise date and always equals the remaining number of years since inception, assuming a total of 5 years. Both of these versions are usually more expensive than the European alternative described earlier in this chapter, since they provide more flexibility to the owner regarding the exercise privilege. Furthermore, alternative 1 is more expensive than alternative 2, since it carries the same number of exercise privileges as alternative 2, but involves an underlying whose duration, and hence price volatility, is higher than under alternative 2 for all but the first exercise date. We conclude this chapter by introducing two important variations on the swaptions we have been discussing. Not surprisingly, options on cross-currency swaps also exist, permitting the buyer on or sometimes before the option's expiration date to enter a cross-currency swap whose underlying currencies, notional in each currency, tenor, and coupons on each leg are determined in advance as of the trade date. So an international borrower could issue a 7-year debt in US dollars, but purchase an option to swap the last 5 years of this debt's coupons, as well as its principal repayment, into euros at predetermined FX rates and coupons, if it sees substantial risk of the dollar appreciating against the euro. This diagram illustrates the mechanics, with a swaption buyer paying an upfront premium to the bank, then exchanging initial notional amounts in two different currencies if the swaption is exercised, a step incidentally which can be omitted, then making periodic exchanges of coupons in the two different currencies during the life of the cross-currency swap, and finally reversing the exchange of notionals on the swap's termination date. Note also that under each leg the index can be floating or fixed and can have different frequencies and day count conventions. Alternatively, a borrower who is somewhat indifferent whether to issue in euros or in US dollars, having substantial cash flows in both of these currencies, can subsidize his funding cost by borrowing in euros, but granting the lender the right to convert the debt's principal and interest payments from euros into dollars, again at predetermined FX rates and coupons on defined dates in the future. This borrower is embedding a short cross-currency swaption in this borrowing, whose premium can be paid upfront or incorporated into the interest rate. Returning to the single currency arena, the market also offers so-called basis swaptions, which are options to enter into a basis swap on a defined date in the future and for a defined term and notional amount. So a bank pays its counterparty a premium upfront in return for the right to enter a 5-year swap in 2 years' time on a $100 notional amount, under which the bank pays 3-month LIBOR and receives 6-month LIBOR minus 25 basis points, or pays 3-month LIBOR and receives Fed funds plus 50 basis points. The diagram illustrates the mechanics, with the swaption buyer paying an upfront premium to the bank, then entering the basis swap if the swaption is exercised, and finally making periodic exchanges of coupons tied to two separate floating indices during the life of the basis swap. One of the quiz questions in Chapter 6 centers around a cross-currency swaption. But right now, we have reached the end of this chapter 2 and of part 1 of this module.